All right. Microphone is working. It's 11:05, time to start the next session. Welcome everyone in the medical research track and my presentation on FHIR for clinical research. Goal for today is explain you a little bit about how clinical research actually works, how the process goes, and how FHIR can be of great help within clinical research. Tell about my experiences with implementation of FHIR within a clinical research application, and hopefully also discuss with you your experiences with it. But for starters, an introduction. Who am I? I'm Sebastiaan Knijnenburg. I'm from Amsterdam. I have a background in medical informatics, as many of the FHIR and FHIR people have as well. I also studied medicine on the side for a couple of years. Decided that computers are a better fit for me than humans, so stick with medical informatics. Got my degree and enrolled in a PhD project in pediatric oncology. That project actually gave me hands-on experience in doing research data management and doing research myself, and also with the challenges that come with it. And even for a very technical person like myself, there were lots of issues in handling the data there. So I learned firsthand that it's also almost impossible for a medical researcher actually to do proper data management themselves, which is why I'm very happy that I could join Castor EDC in 2012 as the CTO, together with Dirk, our founder, who is sitting over there. Castor EDC is a research platform for medical researchers online. Researchers can build their own database without any knowledge about databases, collaborate online, and store their data securely. And currently, we service around 25,000 researchers worldwide who are collaborating on 3,000 research studies on our platform. But I also like to know is what your experiences are and who you are. So a couple of questions. Just raise your hand. Who here is working with FHIR regularly? That's what I expected. Working with clinical data, patient data. Who's involved in research data management? Right, that's still pretty good. And who here has done scientific research themselves and worked on academic papers? Well, that's still a fair amount, which means that we don't have to discuss the research process very elaborately, but I'm still going to give a brief roundup. So let's say you're a researcher, you have this hypothesis, you think that medication A is better than medication B. So you have your idea that you want to validate. You then write the protocol where you describe your experiment, your outcome measures, what do you want to compare, what are your risks, what are your outcomes, and then you start collecting data. You either look up old data or you're going to see new patients and collect data about them. You put everything in a single bucket, a database usually, run it through a statistical analysis program, write the results, and publish an article. And if you're a good boy, you also publish your data, which is not happening too often yet. And in the meantime, you have to adhere to all the regulations. So either your hospital's regulations, your government regulations. The bad thing is that this process is also deeply flawed, and there are many, many problems with it. So creating hypotheses, everyone does that all over the world, but everyone is also doing the same thing over and over again without collaborating. Then the protocols that are being written are very heterogeneous. People use their own measures, and the data that comes out of these trials are non-comparable. Then when you want to reuse data that was collected previously, it's often very hard to get that data, and it's also very error-prone when you have to manually do that. If you want to capture new data, you have to have a tool for that. And often researchers have to build their own tools or have to use very complex tools, expensive tools. If you then have everything, you want to connect to other data sources, the data linkage that you have to do is always manual. And often you have to use expensive tools like trusted third parties to actually get anonymized research data linked together. Then in the data analysis phase, same problem. Everyone runs their own analysis based on their own protocols, which makes that in the end, when you have multiple studies and want to compare and pull the results, you cannot do that because the methods were so different. If you then finish everything, often if the results are not what you expected them to be, the results don't get published, which results in a great scientific bias because there's actually a lot of knowledge in the fact that your hypothesis was wrong. And then when it comes to publishing data, there are very few standardized ways to actually do that. People just upload a CSV file that then becomes basically directly unusable because no one knows what the column headers actually mean. And mostly in the academic context, research projects often don't even comply with, so let's mute this, often don't comply with the regulations. That's a little bit different for industry studies because they have to, but most of the investigator-initiated studies has flaws when it comes to compliance. So if you take all these problems into account, there's a couple of common denominators, which are, it's about data problems, communication problems, and standardization problems, and these are all problems that FHIR is trying to tackle. So there's great opportunity for FHIR to actually help here. So to give a set of examples, automated data capture, improving the fairness of data. I'll go a little bit further into that in a little bit. But also patient recruitment. There's a large problem with finding the right patients for your trial. If you have FHIR repositories that you can query on patient characteristics, it should become a lot easier to find the patients that you actually want to include in your study. FHIR has a consent resource and implementation guides that are now talking about regular consent. For research consent, there is no implementation guide yet, but as soon as that comes, research consent can actually be tracked using FHIR resources as well. And I think there's big opportunities for device integrations. And I know several Dutch companies are making medical devices that actually allow you to export FHIR straight from the device into a repository. But for today, I want to focus on the first two topics, electronic data capture, via data exchange on FHIR, and standardization and improved fairness. As you probably know, research data is very highly structured. In the end, as a researcher, you want to have a tabular data format that you can run your analysis with. And in your protocol, you already define all the data requirements. So you already know exactly what data points you want to collect, whether it's risks, risk measurements, the outcome measurements, you already know it. And also, these data are already available within the EHR for most of it. The problem is that the research database in which these data are collected are usually standalone, and they're either Excel or Access databases, which hopefully no one ever uses anymore, but in practice we still see that a lot. Research projects have one-off databases that are developed specifically for that one research project, or people use electronic data capture tools like Castor, but there's a whole range of open source and commercial companies that offer these tools. And the point is, it's always a standalone database, which means that there's an extremely high level of data duplication. The data that's in the EHR, that's already known in laboratory systems, get transcribed into the research database. And that's a very time-consuming process and also very error-prone. People make lots of errors when they copy this data. So one of the Dutch university medical centers did a business case analysis and a study, and they approximated that they could save around 70 full-time equivalent when they could automate all the data transcription from the EHR into electronic data capture tools. Then it is possible within a hospital to get a nice export of, for example, lab data. My personal experience when I was doing a pediatric oncology study, and I sent a request, can I please have the lab data of these 1,500 patients? I had to wait for 6 months before I got a CSV file that I then had to parse myself, link myself. So it takes a lot of time and lots of effort. So allowing to do this automatically via FHIR could save tons of time and also improve the quality of the data a lot. With Castor, we've now have experience with implementation of FHIR within 3 academic medical centers in the Netherlands. And we started off very simple with 2 FHIR resources to import, patient and observation. But these are also resources that are very time-consuming to actually copy the data off. And especially laboratory data is highly standardized and usually a core part of a medical research study. We implemented 2 different approaches over time, and I'll briefly go into both architectures. It's either a push architecture, where the hospital pushes data from the EHR into our system, or a pull architecture, where we can actually query the data. So for push, There is a clinical research data warehouse in the hospital. It can be based on Epic, on Chipsoft, or whichever EHR provider or database actually there is. And there is a broker application that on a timed schedule iterates over that clinical data warehouse and checks, are these patients enrolled in studies that are collecting data in an external system. In every time interval, the application then checks, all right, there's new data. I'll build a FHIR message on top of this data, and I'll just send this message out to the electronic data capture tool. Then on our side, we receive the message, we present it to the end user so he can actually do the mapping to the right data points within a study, which I'll show in a little bit. The pros of this approach is that the hospital has full control over the data sources to be used, the programming, the resources that are being exposed, and where the data is going to, because they are actually actively sending out the data. Also, the researcher gets a notification when there's new data available for his or her study and his or her patients. And you're very free to build whatever you want. You can use the C# FHIR components, the Java APIs. We've seen Microsoft BizTalk being implemented to send the message, to create and send the messages. Cloverleaf can do it. Basically, the sky is the limit. But on the other side, it also means that someone within the hospital walls has to have the knowledge to build and maintain this application. And if there's no negotiation protocol in place, you just get a data dump. Because the clinical data warehouse has all the data of the patient, all the new data gets collected and gets sent to an external source or external destination. And basically, we receive lots of data that we actually don't really want to have. So for that, you need a negotiation protocol. Which data is actually necessary in which study, so that the broker application can send exactly those data that are required. Also, the recipient then becomes responsible for the handling of the incoming data and the storage of those data, which means that you have to have an infrastructure to handle that. And right now, we just store the messages and let the researcher go through them and map and parse them as they go. Which means that if you have a patient who is in the intensive care unit and sending messages each and every day, as a researcher, you have to go through all the data each and every day to still import the data into your study and into the right place where you want to actually collect it, the study. So an intermediate approach here would be to actually host a FHIR repository, FHIR server with your electronic data capture system, receive all the FHIR messages in there, and then query the FHIR server as an intermediate solution. However, it would even be more preferable if the hospital hosts the FHIR server. So that's the second approach that we've implemented in one of the hospitals here in the Netherlands. In the hospital, you have the electronic health record, you have the laboratory information system, and basically any information system you want. Everything gets hooked up into a medical intelligence data warehouse. And on top of that data warehouse, we implemented a FHIR server or a facade on top of the data warehouse that actually allows you to just send FHIR queries to the data source. Then, as the electronic data capture system, you can just query, we want to have this data from this patient in this time frame and directly get the right data at the right place. I think the most complex part in this approach is that you need to pass through the firewall of the hospital, and the most time-consuming part in previous implementations is actually getting the VPN to get into the hospital. The pros of this pull mechanism is that you only retrieve data that are actually necessary within the research context. You get a live view of the data, so if any data updates are being done during the day, the data can actually be reflected directly. The data stays at the source, so you can also re-trigger that. You can keep a link to that source data element. And you have all this functionality of a FHIR server available to do more with than just querying observations, but also searching data and making very specific data queries. What's harder here is that you have to define access control. Who can actually access which studies and which patients? We are a cloud-based solution. We have 25,000 users. Who is allowed to access which data points within that repository? And how do you take care of pseudonymization? Basically, research is always anonymized or pseudonymized. Privacy of the patients is a great concern. So how do you make sure that you don't send identifying information out of the hospital walls? And as a con, you need a FHIR server in the hospital, which would be great if all the hospitals would have it, but it also requires that there's maintenance and people with knowledge about FHIR server infrastructure within the hospital walls. So getting back at the pseudonymization and anonymization issue, this is actually an issue also with the push mechanism, although a little bit easier. But each and every hospital arranges their own study management flow, their own patient enrollment flows. That means that you have to have hospital-specific implementations on how you actually segregate the access control. You can do it in actually two ways. You can either, in your electronic health record, store the pseudonym of the patient that's used within the research project and use that as the sole identifier when you send data out. Or in the EDC system, you still store the hospital identifier and then use that to make queries. And that's less favorable because that's actually identifiable information. So what we've done so far is always use a study ID. So for a specific research project, one study ID, and then the pseudonym of the patient within the study as the identifier in the patient ID, which means that the FHIR server is configured in such a way that it only exposes those two elements and not the social security number, not the hospital information number, but this as the identifier in all outgoing resources. And what's very interesting is that there is, since SU3, there is the research study and research subject resources, which are still in draft, but these define actually what a study resource and study concept is, and also what a participant within a research project is. And even more interesting is that there is an implementation guide, still in the early stages of the clinical research core, which actually allows for de-identification of the patient data directly. So they define that all the identifiable information on the patient resource gets removed, is not allowed to be there, and then links observations, research study, research subject to that de-identified patient. And that's really useful for future endeavors in this space. And then there is the second problem. If you have a FHIR message with perhaps hundreds of observations of a patient of a single day or of a certain time period, you still need to map that in your research project to that one specific cell where you want to store the data. So as a small example, this is how a research protocol looks within our system. On the left-hand side, you see different visits of a patient going through a research protocol. So inclusion, randomization to a specific treatment allocation, then follow-ups on regular basis. And usually within each visit, the same data gets collected. So you can make longitudinal trends and do your statistical analysis to see that your treatment A or treatment B is actually making a change and having an impact. Forms, well, basically everyone knows how a form looks like. It's data. In this example, it's a urine culture. In this study, there is several measurements of urine, week 1 and week 2, to see if there's inflammation. So if you have this FHIR message, how do you know where in this whole protocol you need to store your data? We solve this by letting the researcher define metadata for each and every element within their study. So for in this case, it's red blood cells, I think. Red blood cell count within the urine, they specify, all right, this relates to a FHIR observation. From the FHIR observation, we want to know the value of it. And we listen to anything that has this code and this codable concept. So here you see that there is a hospital-specific laboratory information system code or a LOIN code. If any of those two passes by, we know that the data can go there. But there may be several repetitions of this one measurement over the course of the study. So you still have to make a mapping. In here, you see an interface. On the left-hand side, you see an incoming FHIR message parsed. I hope it's visible. With all the observations that have been imported. But you have all these visits separated vertically over the course of time. Then actually the course of time is usually your cutting point on how you know which data point goes. So if you add the dates for each and every visit, you can directly import, all right, these data points belong here, here, here. And if you know the time frames for your different visits, you can actually make this mapping automatic. And then you only have to approve, all right, these are the data points I want. I'm going to store them here. And this greatly improves the workflow for a researcher that instead of copy and pasting or manually transcribing these 50 or 100 measurements, all the data is directly at the right place at the right time. Now, it would be very useful if this could happen automatically already in the electronic health record. And that's basically what the previous speaker was talking about. So Lloyd Mackenzie explained a lot about the structured data capture implementation guideline. which provides an infrastructure to standardize and automate data capture using forms, using questionnaire and questionnaire responses as FHIR resources, and providing a lot of guidance around how you can actually automate data extraction, data population. So I highly recommend you to check out this presentation if you weren't here before. As a small summary of how that process works, is that there's a form or template library, like an electronic data capture tool that Castor is, and the electronic health record, when a patient is enrolled, can actually query the form library to receive, all right, we need this data for this patient, please give me a form. Then that form can be automatically pre-populated or automatically populated with data from the EHR. It can be completed by the doctor or nurse that's actually sitting behind the EHR, and then can post the questionnaire response back to the data repository, which can be any external tool. And what's very nice about this approach is that it leads to a standardized form library and common data element library that can be reused by multiple researchers within the same hospital, but ultimately also by multiple hospitals, professional organizations. And that brings me to the second big point where FHIR can really help with medical research, which is improving the fairness of data. And for those who are not familiar with the FHIR principles and FHIR guidelines, FHIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's a set of principles that were published in 2016 and that describe that data, metadata, and infrastructure should adhere as much as possible to these 4 items. With the FHIR data point, the infrastructure part of FHIR, they describe how you can publish your data to make them absolutely reusable for future use cases. But that implies that you have proper metadata for each and every data point that you have in your study. And that metadata is actually hard. If you're a medical researcher, let's say a cardiologist, you know everything about the heart, about heart disease, but you don't know anything about terminology systems like SNOMED, LOINC. You just want to have your research project. So this metadata definition is hard. We try to build tools to help them with it, but FHIR actually can greatly help simplify this problem because FHIR already has the code systems, has these systems in place. If at the source of the data, which is actually the EHR, the laboratory information system, these code systems use international standards and get supplied there already at the source, FHIR makes the whole FAIR process for the researcher a lot easier. And on the other end, if you convert it, the requirements of FAIR also can push FHIR forward quite a lot. In basically all new funding projects of the European Union, but also of the Dutch funding agencies or UK agencies, FAIR is a hard requirement to get any money out of the funding agency. So before you apply for a fund, you have to supply the information about how you are going to publish your data in a fair manner. So by this requirement, I'm pretty sure that FHIR can actually push forward this FAIR, and FAIR can push forward FHIR, and it can be a great symbiosis. The only thing that's still problematic is the fact that each and every hospital that we've seen so far still uses their own code systems and puts very little efforts in standardizing and using standardized coding systems. And of course, it's not possible to have one ubiquitous language because the context of each and every data point is different between specialisms, between hospitals, but providing some kind of standardized terminology like LOINC or SNOMED on top of your local would be a great help already. So, getting into the conclusions, I think that FHIR can bring great things to clinical research, solve quite a lot of the problems that we see with it, clinical research, cover data exchange, patient recruitment, consent, device integration. What we see is that the uptake within the Dutch hospitals is very steadily increasing. We've been using FHIR now for a little bit over 3 years. And we can also see here at the FHIR DevDays, there's basically people from all the big Dutch hospitals that are interested and are starting to use FHIR, which is great because if the uptake really takes on and everyone builds on top of FHIR and builds FHIR repositories within their hospital walls, and there's profiles around it, which have been worked on last week with the HL7 working group, it would make for a lot easier data extraction for clinical research later on. And like I said, metadata annotation is a core priority to actually make this process go more smoothly. So anyone who's working here with building FHIR repositories in these hospitals, please, please, please focus on these international standards so that there's a common terminology system that researchers can use. And of course, collaborate on national and specialism-focused FHIR profiles. What I really like to know is actually what your experiences are, because we are one commercial company in the Netherlands working with FHIR. I'm really interested to see what other companies and other organizations are doing when it comes to FHIR. Please share them either right now or at the table here in the shared space over the course of the next few days. And let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, great talk. So in your pipeline, who handles the complexity of mapping from maybe the hospital's proprietary CSV schema to the FHIR schema? And is it done by in a general basis or like per use case basis?
So let me repeat the question. It's who is responsible in the hospital for mapping from the data warehouse, the data sources within the hospital to the FHIR resources? Is that what you asked? All right, yeah, so far that's been absolutely use case based. So each and every hospital has their own systems in place, and the mapping needs to be made based on their own systems internally. So we are working often with FHIR and FHIR to actually help the hospitals to make these mappings. Or within the hospitals, there's people with experience already, and they support their own tooling and own transformations there. In the mapping, if you mean how the researcher then goes from the FHIR resource to the study data point itself, this is of course something that you don't want the researcher to repeat each and every time. So we provide a search interface where they can just search free text on glucose to get the right metadata for glucose. And the good part is that you can share these templates, form templates, and reuse them throughout all the studies that you're doing. Share them with your colleagues so that the whole cardiology department has the same laboratory profiles and can grab the data. So it's basically configure once and reuse over the course of time. And this is also something where the SDC implementation guide and profiles for questionnaires can become of great use over the next year or two.
I have a question. In your push implementation?
Yes.
In the push implementation, so go back to it.
Yeah.
Are you actually using FHIR messages? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, messages, bundles. And that's why I said it would be very nice if we could put right here a FHIR server, because right now we just store the messages until the researcher wants to do something with it, which means that if there's daily messages, it's very hard to skim through. If you would have a FHIR server that actually takes those messages, puts them in a repository, you can actually have the researcher go query that data and be a lot more efficient. So that's future plans. Microphone is coming your way.
Just to pick up the example of the lab data transfer. So what about the part where you actually want to know which visits and schedules you have? So let's say you're doing screening visit and then you're doing a follow-up visit. You actually would want to have the part of the protocol which you've modeled in your EDC system actually in the middleware of the lab pushing so that you'd be able to actually select the metadata and push the stuff in. That would be the point of actually using FHIR to reuse the schedule. So have you any experience doing that stuff? Have you tried to do that, sharing the protocol with the primary systems?
Not yet, no. I think the first problem there is the formal definition of a protocol. So how do you actually specify that? Only recently I learned that there's actually a way within FHIR to model the entire protocol using workflows. But that's actually not how the researcher defines this protocol, let alone that A, the lab knows, and B, our system knows. So ultimately, that would be beautiful, but right now, that's not where we are at yet.
I was wondering about you mentioned in the list of problems for the research process below. You mentioned that it's very uncommon that researchers or academic contexts studies adhere to regulations. Are you working on that to support them with that? For example, the provenance resource times?
Actually, not with FHIR resources, but with actually the entire application that we built to do the research process. Yeah, we completely supply them with all the tools they need to be compliant, to have full audit trails. The provenance and the audit element, audit event are absolutely the things that we will think about in the future. Yeah, yeah.
So if we talk to researchers about FHIR, they often respond with, what? What are you talking about?
Yep.
So I was wondering, also, when you go to publishing the data, you may want to do that in the FHIR data model, right? So there has to be some communication to the researchers to think in
FHIR, yeah, definitely there is an education aspect to it, because the funding agencies start requiring this publishing of the data when the research is done, the public awareness among researchers is really improving over the last 2 years, because otherwise they won't get any funding. So slowly but steadily they are starting to get a little bit more knowledge, but we can really serve a good communication role there to educate them.
But are you enforcing them to structure the data in terms of the FHIR data model?
Not yet, no. We're
Thinking of it?
absolutely, and that's what the nice part about FHIR and FHIR. There's been quite a lot of efforts to combine the two, and right now there's an RDF data model of the FHIR SU3, or actually I think also for SU2, so that you can actually express FHIR data using triples and RDF. Our data publishing strategy has been focused around RDF as well, annotating your data with metadata in general. And we are slowly getting those two closer together. So by annotating your data points with which FHIR elements they refer to, you can actually convert it also from data going in to data going out and expose the data there as FHIR observations, and either using RDF or perhaps also other formats later on. But definitely should be FHIR in the end as well. Basically, the transformation shouldn't really matter. If you have the data and it's annotated correctly, you should be able to go from format A to format B without any problems.
You're actually, I'm supervising PhD student at Castor, and Sebastiaan will also be supervising him very soon. And he's looking into using, seeing if we can actually use FHIR to let researchers define their data structure. So ideally, what we're trying to do is create a semantically interpretable data model right at the start. And FHIR seems like the best way to as a framework to let them do that. So there might be a future in which we have a tool where you are basically dragging and dropping FHIR resources, where the sort of the relation between resources is already pre-mapped, where the researcher only has to sort of fix potential issues where you have, say, a brother or a sister that has a disease instead of the original patient that's included in the record. But that's something I think in the next 6 months we'll make a lot of progress with in terms of seeing if it's feasible to allow someone without training in FHIR or semantic data to define a data model that can then publish semantically interpretable data either in FHIR or RDF.
Yeah, and there's interesting opportunities as well. For example, the ZIPs, the detailed clinical models that are available and published by the Dutch ICT and healthcare organization, NICTIS, actually provide you with very nice building blocks to build your study forms as well. So if you want to collect a blood pressure, you can use the DCM for blood pressure, and you have all the annotations right there in place. So that's also something we're looking into to actually use as a source for form building.
So you basically you're using the bundle approach, if I understand properly, to transfer the data. So you're basically defining bundles, and then you're transferring the data to your EDC system. So the process of actually mapping those resources to actually that's what it's going to boil down to for the clinical database developer as they having a sense of clinical trials? Yeah.
That's a good question, and to a certain extent right now, we really have to let the researcher define that mapping with several elements themselves, and that's a time-consuming process. So here you see that for one data point, they have to define which FHIR resource, which part of the resource they want to store, and then which coding systems are in use. But this data you can reuse for every element within your study that you mapped once. You can copy that for each and every visit, and then you can standardize those forms for the entire hospital. So for example, in one of the hospitals here in the Netherlands that we're working with, they decided, let's not go full laboratory information system. Let's map out one big form with the 25 most used lab measurements, annotate that perfectly, upload it on our internal network so that everyone can reuse that, and we are 100% sure that those data go over correctly. On the long term, we want to extend this with a way better UI and UX, so that as a researcher, if you type in white blood cells, the system automatically suggests, all right, you are looking at an observation, you want to store the value, etc. These are the codes. And that's a matter of machine learning and reading all the data that we already have and using that to make suggestions for other researchers and provide them with a better user experience. So far, we've been mapping patient and observation resources mostly. It gets a lot more complex if you start looking into other FHIR resources like medication. Even condition is already a pretty hard one to map, because in your research project you may want to know, is there a family history of this disease? Which diseases are there in the history at all? It's all different type of transformations that you need to be able to map. And that's something we're working on right now to make a proper UI for that, so that the researcher doesn't have to think about the entire FHIR concept. But yeah, I think also the SDC can actually help there, because there's lots of definitions in there that provide these transformations.
Maybe just one final question. Have you any experience with concomitant medications? Extracting that stuff from the primary?
Not yet, no. On the roadmap, though.
In the integrations that you've done so far, where has the responsibility for pseudonymization? As in, has it been the responsibility of the hospital or of
yeah, pseudonymization, a real tongue breaker. So far, what we've done is each and every time, put the responsibility in the hospital. Each and every hospital has their own system to register which studies are going on, and then how to enroll patients within each study. However, common denominator is there's always an identification code for a study, and there's always a way within the electronic health record how patients get enrolled, and to store a unique identifier specifically for that study, for that patient. And that allows us to combine the two, study ID and research patient identifier within the study, as the global patient identifier in the FHIR server. So that's where the pseudonymization lies there.
But there isn't a standard existing component that handles the direct mapping from patient to patient?
Nope, not yet. But I hope to hear more experiences of people that are actually extracting healthcare data in the coming 3 days to see if it actually would be possible to define such a system. We've got 1 minute left, but if there's no more questions, then we can wrap up.